Hi, I'm Brian E. Denton, author of the book A Year of War and Peace and the poetry collection Inspiration. Welcome to my channel. This video is part of a series I'm doing on Dante's Divine Comedy, wherein I'm reading through the entire Divine Comedy, all three books, the Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso, at a rate of 3 cantos, or chapters, per week. I'm doing this as my own independent contribution to Baylor University's 100 Days of Dante Project. If you haven't heard of that project, be sure to click the link I provide down in the show notes because you're going to like what you find there. High quality stuff, scholarly presentation. If this is your first time visiting the channel, first of all, welcome. Thanks for coming. And if you would please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. I've set myself the goal of getting to 250 subscribers by the end of November. At the time of recording, I think we're at 212, maybe 211 subscribers, so it's totally possible to get up to 250 by month's end, especially with your help. So thanks in advance for that. Also, if you're a first-time visitor, you'll see that these videos follow a certain pattern. You'll have this introduction, which will be followed by a synopsis, where I will cover the major plot points and the action of the canto under discussion. After that, there'll be a characters and themes section, and then a section I call the takeaway, where I will offer my own personal thoughts on the canto and how we can use the canto's lessons to live better lives ourselves. After that, I'll wrap things up with an outro, and then you'll just go wherever the YouTube algorithm takes you. So with that, let's get right into it then. Today's canto is Dante's Inferno, Canto 26. Dante opens up today's canto by throwing some shade, pun intended, at his native city of Florence. He says that Florence's fame is so deep that it resounds even in hell. He's saying this because, as we've noted before, so many of the denizens of hell seem to be from Florence. In fact, he counts 5 of these Florentines just in the last ditch of Mabolge alone. So things really aren't going too well for his native city of Florence. And you'll also have to keep in mind that he's writing this at a time when he is in exile, having been kicked out of Florence after a false charge of fraud was brought against him. At any rate, he moves on from the 7th ditch to the 8th ditch, and along the way he finds that it's extremely dark. So dark, in fact, that he has to guide himself by use of his hands to get there, and it's so difficult and dangerous, in fact, that he almost trips and falls into the 8th ditch. Treacherous road. Our 2 poet heroes eventually do get to the 8th ditch of Mabolge, and this is where the evil counselors are kept. And as Virgil explains, the evil counselors are enwrapped in flames as they go about in the 8th ditch. Dante the poet then notices that there's a unique flame down there in the 8th ditch. And this unique flame is unique because it's rising like the Twin Towers, seems to be riven at the top. And so naturally he asked Virgil about this riven flame. And Virgil explains that this particular flame actually hosts 2 centers, Ulysses, wily Odysseus, and Diomedes. Dante, of course, as a big fan of classical literature, as we've seen throughout this poem, insists on talking to these 2. So Virgil, on his behalf, summons them to talk. And right away, Ulysses launches into this great story about his final adventure on Earth. The story he tells is actually quite similar to the poem by Alfred Lord Tennyson, Ulysses. And basically what happens is that Ulysses gets bored with his domestic life, decides to go absentee father on his family, and sets off with a bunch of companions to the open sea. And just real quick, lines 112 through 120 are some of my favorite lines in this canto. This is where Ulysses rouses his men to go on this great adventure with him, and I just really like reading them. Maybe you will too. Anyway, those who are roused by this speech are soon disappointed because their great adventure ends in death and destruction when a whirlpool kills them all. In this canto, we leave the 7th ditch of Mabolge, where the thieves are collected, and we move on to the 8th ditch, where the sins are the sins of evil counsel. And these are the people who misused or improperly used their God-given intellectual powers. Ciardi, in his commentary on the canto, describes this sin as the abuse of the gifts of the Almighty to steal his virtues for low purposes. And typically, and we're going to see a great example of this in the canto, this sin is committed most effectively by the issuance of glib speech. And that brings us to the punishment administered in this canto. Once again, the punishment is intricately connected to the sin that's being punished by means of a wonderful and quite beautiful Dantean contrapasso. The sinners of evil counsel are punished by being eternally enveloped within burning flames. So just as they stole from God in their earthly lives and worked in hidden evil ways, so too are they now hidden by these awful flames. There's also the biblical relationship between false speech and fire. See James chapter 3, verse 6, and the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. Now, since well over half of this canto is dedicated to just one of those flames, or two depending on how you count, it's best to focus on this or those flames for the bulk of our characters and themes section today. So that's what we're going to do in today's characters and themes section. We're going to focus on this one particular flame, or two flames, depending on how you count. But I'm going to apologize in advance because I'm going to go off book here. And what I mean by that is, typically in preparation for these videos, what I'll do is, in addition to reading the Ciardi translations and the Hollander translation, I'll also read through all the available English language commentary. And I'll try to provide a synthesis of all that commentary for you in these videos. But like I said, in this video, I'm going to go off book and offer my own thoughts. And just like when I go off book in my chess openings, it's probably going to result in a blunder. So again, sorry. So with all that said, the part of the canto that we're going to focus on today starts at line 52, where Dante the Pilgrim notices that there's this special type of flame down there amongst all the other flames. Here's what he says. Who is in the flame so riven at the tip, it could be rising from the pyre on which Eteocles was laid out with his brother? There's a general consensus among the commentators on this canto that the riven flame that Dante refers to is a reference to the burning corpses of Eteocles and Polynices, the two brothers in Statius's Thebaid. Now, you'll recall from our video for Canto 14 that Dante has already dropped a reference to the Thebaid so far in his poem. And all I'm going to say is that it's probably pretty smart to pick up whatever Dante drops. So you're going to want to go out and get the Thebaid if you haven't already. The Loeb Classical Library has a pretty good edition. It comes in 2 volumes. I suggest you get that. So with that, Dante and Virgil go down to take a closer look at this riven flame. And it turns out that this flame is reminiscent of the pyre found in Statius's Thebaid. And what happened there was you have these two warring brothers, Eteocles and Polynices, and even in death they can't get along because the smoke that rises from their bodies, which are burning in the same pyre, refuse to commingle with each other. So from this same family tree, we get a little bit of crown shyness. And the same thing is happening down here in the 8th ditch of Nabolch with these two sinners. Though these two sinners occupy the same flame, it's riven at the top. The flames are somehow connected and yet not connected. And Virgil tells Dante that these two sinners are none other than Ulysses and Diomedes, and they're being punished for the stealing of the Palladium and their part also in the Trojan horse story. Dante is immediately intrigued. Like we said in the synopsis, and we know from our previous reading of this poem, he's a big fan of classical literature. So naturally, he's going to want to talk with Ulysses and Diomedes. But Virgil says, hold up, it's probably best that I talk to him because these are Greek speakers, and you, Dante, are not a Greek speaker. So they're probably going to think that you're a barbarian and not want to do a quick stop and chat. So Virgil asks them to explain their stories, and Ulysses launches into this great mini-epic about the last adventure he had on Earth. And this speech that he gives is a lot like Virgil's speech about his native Mantua back in Canto 20. It doesn't really move the story forward at all, but it is very interesting to listen to. The basic story is that Ulysses, I guess having grown bored with his domestic life, decides to step out on Penelope and Telemachus for some cigarettes and never return. The simple life really isn't good enough for him. He wants adventure in his life. So he convinces some of his companions to join him on this great seafaring adventure, and he convinces them by abusing his God-given intellectual talents, by speaking persuasively that they too want to enjoy this great adventure and to learn more about the world and all these great high-minded things. But in reality, he just needs oarsmen to get there. Well, they all head out into the deep for their adventure. They go beyond the mapped world. They even see for the first time the peak of purgatory. And just after this occurs, the ocean decides to kill them by means of a whirlpool. So who's wily now, my man? And this is where my thinking on the canto comes in. With these wonderful verses, we now have 2 stories of Ulysses on the open sea. We have the story found in the Odyssey of Ulysses surviving his encounter with the sirens, and we also have this new story in Dante's Inferno where Ulysses perishes on his open sea adventure. For me, these 2 separate sea adventures represent 2 distinct ways of approaching or understanding the world. And for purposes of convenience and distinction, I'm now going to refer to either Odysseus or Ulysses. When I mention Odysseus, I'm going to be referring to the story from the Odyssey, where Odysseus encounters the sirens. When I refer to Ulysses, I'm going to be referring to the seafaring adventure that we read about in today's canto, where Ulysses goes on the open sea with his companions and perishes by means of whirlpool. The stories of Odysseus and Ulysses are very similar in that they're both open sea adventures of great bravery and great heroism. But they differ, however, in how their main characters, Odysseus and Ulysses, approach adventure. You'll recall from the story of Odysseus that Circe warns him that his adventures will take him past the sirens, who have this irresistible song that attracts men to their demise. And the sirens are not beautiful, seductive women, like their song makes them out to be. They're in fact these horrible monsters who lure sailors in with this siren song and then destroy them. According to Circe, Odysseus must take great pains to avoid even hearing this song, because to do so will open him up to almost certain doom. In fact, certain doom. No one is known to have ever survived hearing the song of the sirens. But you have to remember that Odysseus is a great adventurer, and he wants to experience life. So he devises a plan that will allow him to hear the siren song and live to tell the tale. So what he does is he fills all his shipmates' ears with beeswax so they cannot hear the siren song. Then he has them tie him to the ship's mast so he can't move or get away. And he tells them that no matter what happens, no matter what he says, don't listen to him, just keep sailing the ship forward. And this way, he's able to hear the siren song and survive it, because he can't direct the ship to the island where they're going to murder him for having, lured him in with their siren song. So to sum up, and this is the most important part, Odysseus places limits upon himself to survive the siren song. Contrast this with the story of Ulysses told in today's canto. There are no such limits. This is Ulysses unbounded. Ulysses just wants to go balls to the wall adventuring. He doesn't care. No limits for this guy. He says he's overcome by a fervor to go see the world and to gain knowledge and adventure. Ulysses also makes it clear that he has surpassed the limits of human knowledge, the ones that Hercules himself set up for mankind. So Ulysses is literally sailing blind, living unlimitedly, and he dies for it. These two stories remind me of the distinction between the classical view of the world and the romantic view of the world. And these two conflicting visions of the world I take from the School of Life's webpage. And if you're interested in reading this article in full, I'll provide a link down in the show notes. Here's what the School of Life has to say about the classical vision and the romantic vision. A classical view of life is founded upon an intense, pessimistic awareness of the frailties of human nature and on a suspicion of unexamined instinct. The classical attitude knows that our emotions can frequently overpower our better insights, that we repeatedly misunderstand ourselves and others, and that we are never far from folly, harm, and error. For me, it's Odysseus who represents this view of life. He doesn't trust himself to survive the siren song. He understands his own frailties. So instead of relying on his own personal counsel, he relies instead on the inherited wisdom of the past, this given to him by Circe. He knows that history shows that no one survives the siren song, so he imposes limits on himself. And this pessimism concerning his own individual strength of mind is what ends up preserving his life. Contrast this with Ulysses. Like we said, Ulysses places no limits upon himself. He sails blindly into the unknown world, possessed by this great romantic vision of adventure and individual experience. And he even persuades his companions to not deny themselves their own adventure and to follow him into the unknowable. This is the romantic mind, again from the School of Life. At the core of the romantic attitude is a trust in feeling and instinct as supreme guides to life, and a corresponding suspicion of reason and analysis. Romanticism hates institutions and venerates the brave outsider who fights heroically against the status quo. It likes what is new rather than recurring. The romantic spirit pits itself against analysis. It believes there is such a thing as thinking too much, rather than just thinking badly. It doesn't favor logic or discourse. It is offended by what is humdrum and ordinary, and longs for the special, the rare, the distinctive, and the exclusive. It likes revolution rather than evolution. The romantic attitude disdains organization, punctuality, clarity, bureaucracy, industry, commerce, and routine. So what can be said looking at these two stories that Odysseus survives and thrives by relying not only on himself, but rather on the wisdom of inherited tradition and the slowly accrued knowledge born from ages of experience. Ulysses, on the other hand, perishes by following his feelings into the unknown, where there are no guardrails of good behavior. The classical pessimistic view of the world is often represented by the great Greek tragedies or the Roman Stoics, but this view also has biblical antecedents. I'm speaking of the so-called wisdom books of the Old Testament. These are a great treasure trove of the classical pessimistic worldview. In particular, I'm talking about the book of Job and Ecclesiastes. I'll share two of my favorite passages from these books with you that I believe are thematically relevant to today's canto, and then I'll leave you with a quote from Shakespeare, which I believe will help us use this view of the world to live better lives ourselves. The first passage I'd like to share to you comes from the book of Job. It comes from the 14th chapter of that book, and this is where Job is addressing God. Here's what Job has to say. Man that is born of a woman is of few days and full of trouble. He cometh forth like a flower, and is cut down. He fleeth also as a shadow, and continueth not. And dost thou open thine eyes upon such a one, and bringest me into judgment with thee? Who can bring a clean thing out of an unclean? Not one. Seeing his days are determined, the number of his months are with thee, thou hast appointed his bounds, that he cannot pass. Bounds that he cannot pass. Ulysses learns what happens when you pass these bounds. Odysseus learns what happens when you limit yourself to them. Bounds that he cannot pass. I don't think that Job is just talking about the limited number of days that we have on this earth. I think he's actually talking more about the concept of epistemic distance that we discussed in our video for Canto 21. And there what I was trying to express is that creation is just simply too complicated for the fragile, limited mind of man to comprehend in its totality. I'm not saying that knowledge is unattainable. I'm just saying that perfect knowledge is unattainable, particularly in complex systems like society itself. So then, how best to live? One answer is found in the book of Ecclesiastes, which provides a really great example of the classical pessimistic view of the world. The words of the wise are as goads, and as nails fastened by the masters of assemblies, which are given from one shepherd. The experience of others who have come before us, the light of the collected wisdom of the ages, is what should guide us in this dark world. And because the world is indeed dark, because the world is broken, because we live in a world where the New York Mets have less World Series championships than the Atlanta Braves, because of all this, it's best to be cautious and to consider the worst that can happen before deciding on the best path to take. Consider then the words of Cassius. And as you read these words, think about who heeded them to their benefit, Odysseus or Ulysses. But since the affairs of men rest still uncertain, let's reason with the worst that may befall. Alright, that concludes my video for Canto 26 of Dante's Inferno. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did enjoy it, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Remember that we're trying to get up to 250 subscribers by the end of November, and with your help, I'm sure we can get there. But in addition to just getting likes for this video or subscriptions to the channel, it's best to get a conversation going down in the comments. So to that end, I've got a question I'd like everyone to answer. And that question is this: are you on Team Odysseus or Team Ulysses? Are you of the classical mind or of the romantic mind? Give me reasons why, too. Let me know what you think. I'm very interested to hear it. Aside from that, just know that we're going to be publishing these videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. So the next video is going to be released on Wednesday. Until then, take care of yourselves and others. I'm doing this as my own independent contribution to Baylor University's 100 Days of Dante Project. If you haven't heard of that project, be sure to click the link I provide down in the show notes because you're going to like what you find there. High quality stuff, scholarly presentation of Dante's Inferno, compared to what you're going to see here, which is garbage. With that said...